Hi, Biology 1 students. This is Ms. Piper with your lesson on cells and cell structure, which means we're going to be focused on cell compartmentalization, which is going to be a specific focus on cell organelles and what they actually do in cells or what their actual function is. Before we begin our lesson on cell compartmentalization, we need to remind you of a few things related to cells that we've already talked about, and that's going to be the three major parts to the cell theory. And that actually says, the cell theory actually says that all cells come from pre-existing cells. Cells are the basic units for life, and all living organisms are composed of cells. Another specific thing that you need to be mindful of when we're thinking about cells and what they do and the function of the organelles found in them is that cells are responsible for three things. Cells are responsible for doing work. Cells are responsible for making energy, and cells are responsible for what we call gas exchange. So let us go ahead and dive right on in and remind ourselves of the two types of cells that are found amongst living organisms. Those two types of cells are called prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And so we already did a comparison between the two, knowing that prokaryotic cells have no true nucleus, while eukaryotic cells actually have a true center, which means they have a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells have no membrane-bound organelles, while eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles. The genetic material found in prokaryotic cells are usually going to be found in the form of what we call a plasmid or a nucleoid, while in eukaryotic cells, you're going to find that genetic material that we call DNA in the actual nucleus. So those are a couple of things that you need to be mindful as you compare and you think about the two types of cells that we are familiar with. An example, of course, of prokaryotic cells is going to be bacteria. So an example of prokaryotic cells would be bacteria. And when you think of eukaryotic cells, you should be thinking about protists, plants, and animal cells. The other thing that you need to be thinking about when you compare or contrast prokaryotic cells is that prokaryotic cells have no membrane-bound organelles. That means they have less organization. It means that the organelles found in a prokaryote or a bacterial cell are free-floating, and it means that they have no barrier between the actual organelle and the outside. So it's very interesting structure and lack of organization when you think about prokaryotes. When you think about eukaryotes, they do have membrane-bound organelles, which means that every organelle or every cell part has its own cell membrane. So when you think about comparing and contrasting prokaryotes and eukaryotes, you need to think about that every single part or every single organelle for a eukaryote has a plasma membrane itself. So while the entire cell has a plasma membrane, that means that the nucleus has a plasma membrane. That means that the vacuoles have a plasma membrane. That means the mitochondria has a plasma membrane. That means that the chloroplasts have a plasma membrane. But prokaryotic cells do not have any membrane-bound organelles. So that means that both the prokaryote and the eukaryote have ribosomes. And so that means that the ribosome does not have its own cell membrane like all the other organelles. But the key thing that you need to be mindful of is that all living cells have a main plasma membrane, which means that both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have a major barrier for its cells called a plasma membrane. But the difference is that eukaryotic organelles eukaryotic cell parts have their own plasma membranes within themselves. So it's kind of like a plasma membrane within a plasma membrane, if you will. So now that we've kind of compared eukaryotes and prokaryotic cells, I want to jump into cell organelles. You have to understand that these functions are key to cells, again, making energy, doing work, and being involved in what we call gas exchange. And we're going to start with the nucleus. The nucleus is a cell part or an organelle found in eukaryotes, and it is considered the true center of eukaryotic cells. The true center. Remember, EU, U means true, and karyo means nucleus or center. And so the nucleus is going to be the true center of eukaryotic cells. And the reason why it is considered that is because there is some genetic material found there. And that genetic material, of course, is DNA, and RNA can also be found in the nucleus. And it is where DNA is stored. So DNA is actually stored in the nucleus and cannot leave the nucleus because it is a very large macromolecule. So it always stays in the nucleus and never leaves. But there is a form of genetic material that actually does, and we'll talk about that a little later in the semester. And of course, that's going to be RNA. And so the nucleus, as we mentioned, has its own plasma membrane, and we call that the nuclear envelope or the nuclear membrane. And so the nuclear membrane or the nuclear envelope controls what leaves and enters the nucleus. One of the things that you need to be mindful about the nucleus is, as I mentioned, is that DNA is stored in the nucleus. And because DNA is stored in the nucleus is responsible for directing the activity of the cell. It controls what the cell does. And so just to be mindful that true center that is found in eukaryotes that we call the nucleus houses DNA. And because DNA is there, DNA provides the instructions for the activity of the cell. Therefore, the nucleus is going to control the activity of the cell. So moving forward, as we talk about controlling and directing the activity of the cell, one of the things that I mentioned to you in the past is that proteins do everything. That's the macromolecule that I told you is responsible for a lot of duties and work in the cell. And one of the organelles that is responsible for making proteins is called the ribosome. The ribosome is a structure in the cells that's responsible for what we call protein synthesis. Protein synthesis is when we make proteins. Synthesis means to make or put together, and ribosomes are responsible for making or putting together proteins. You have two types. You have ribosomes that are free throughout the cytoplasm of the cell, and you have some ribosomes that are actually attached to another type of organelle called rough ER or rough endoplasmic reticulum. And rough ER is responsible also for protein synthesis. And the reason why it is because ribosomes are attached to it. So it should only make sense to you that rough ER is going to be involved in the making of proteins. And so while we're on proteins, once they have been actually made and put together in the ribosomes, it's going to be the Golgi apparatus, or what we call Golgi bodies, that are going to actually package the proteins. They're what I like to call the UPS of the cell. They make sure that all of the proteins have been put together correctly and sent out into the cell to do actually what their actual function will be. So the next organelle that you need to be familiar with is smooth ER. Smooth endoplasmic reticulum. And that particular organelle is responsible for making membranes. And how? How are they responsible for making membranes, Miss Piper? They're responsible for making membranes by making lipids. And we all know that one of the functions of lipids is to make membranes. And that's what smooth ER or smooth endoplasmic reticulum does. It makes lipids and therefore it also makes membranes. Now, there's another special structure that I need you to be familiar with that's found in eukaryotic cells. And that is going to be something called, or an organelle called, the vacuole. And the vacuole is responsible for food and water storage. And when you look at the vacuole, you're going to have a bunch of many small ones in animal cells. But in plant cells, they're very large and central. They are so large and central that students often mistake the vacuole in plant cells as the nucleus. So I'm telling you that ahead of time so that when you look at plant structure, you're paying attention that the vacuole is what is actually large and in the center of plant cells. The other type of vacuole that I need you to be familiar with that is often found in protists is the contractile vacuole. The contractile vacuole is responsible for osmoregulation in protists, like the amoeba, euglena, and paramecium. And what it does is osmo means water, regulation means control. So what the contractile vacuole would do in protists like the euglena, paramecium, and the amoeba is that it will control the amount of water that is in those types of cells. What it does, it acts like a pump, and it pumps the water out of the euglena, paramecium, and the amoeba. So that's the contractile vacuole that is responsible for osmoregulation. Osmo means water, regulation means control. Therefore, the contractile vacuole is responsible for controlling the amount of water found in protists. The next organelle that you need to be familiar with as it relates to cell organelles or cell structure is going to be something called the mitochondria. The mitochondria is a cell organelle found in eukaryotes that's responsible for what we call cellular respiration. It's when we break down sugar and we use that to make energy called ATP. And so the mitochondria is one of those organelles that you read about a couple of days ago that was considered a primordial or prehistoric bacteria. And so it contains its own DNA. So the mitochondria has the ability not only to just make ATP, but it also can duplicate or copy itself due to the fact that it has its own DNA. This concludes our lesson on cell structure, part 1.